Picture this. It's December 1941, and America has just been dragged into the deadliest conflict in human history. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Germany controls most of Europe. The Axis powers seem unstoppable, their war machines finely tuned after years of conquest. And what does America have? Factories that make cars, refrigerators, and washing machines. The enemy is laughing. Hitler himself dismisses the United States as a nation of shopkeepers and gangsters, incapable of matching German industrial precision. But in the span of just 4 years, pause for effect, America would produce more tanks, ships, aircraft, and ammunition than all the Axis nations combined. This is the untold story of how American workers, engineers, and industrialists turned the tide of World War II not with a single heroic act, but with millions of them, performed every day in factories from Detroit to Los Angeles. This is the story of the arsenal of democracy, where ordinary Americans became the unsung heroes who literally built victory from scratch. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt coined the phrase "arsenal of democracy" in a fireside chat on December 29, 1940, America wasn't even in the war yet. But FDR understood something that would prove prophetic. Wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories. And America had something no other nation possessed: an industrial capacity so vast, so flexible, and so innovative that it could be transformed into an unstoppable war machine. But here's the thing most people don't realize. In 1939, the United States military ranked 17th in the world. 17th, behind Romania. The American Army had fewer than 200,000 men, and equipment so outdated that soldiers trained with wooden rifles and trucks labeled tank because there weren't enough real ones. If you had told anyone in 1939 that within 6 years, American factories would produce 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3,000 naval vessels, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition, they would have called you insane. But that's exactly what happened. And it started with a uniquely American approach to problem solving: mass production. You see, while the Germans and Japanese built weapons with precision craftsmanship, each tank individually assembled by skilled workers, each aircraft a work of engineering art, Americans approached warfare like they approached making cars. Henry Ford had revolutionized manufacturing with the assembly line, breaking down complex processes into simple, repeatable steps that anyone could learn. Now that same philosophy would be applied to instruments of war. And this is where the brilliance of American ingenuity truly shines. Because while the Germans were producing their superior Tiger tanks at a rate of about 1,300 per year, requiring skilled labor and specialized parts, American factories were churning out 50,000 Sherman tanks annually. Were the Shermans individually superior to Tigers? No. But here's the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. 5 Shermans could surround and destroy 1 Tiger. And America could replace those 5 Shermans faster than Germany could build another Tiger. Let me take you inside one of these industrial miracles: the Willow Run plant in Michigan. This massive facility, built by Ford Motor Company in 1941, was designed for one purpose: to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber, one of the most complex machines ever created at that time. These weren't simple devices. A single B-24 contained 1.2 million parts, 313,237 rivets, and required 450,000 individual manufacturing operations. Before Willow Run, aircraft manufacturers were building bombers essentially by hand, producing maybe 1 or 2 per week. The experts said it was impossible to mass-produce something so complex. Ford said, "Watch us." Within 2 years, Willow Run was producing 1 complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, every single hour. Imagine standing at the end of that assembly line, watching as a four-engine bomber, a flying fortress weighing 36,000 pounds, rolls off the line, ready for combat, and knowing that in exactly 1 hour, another one will follow. The plant operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its peak, Willow Run alone produced half of all B-24s built during the entire war, over 8,000 aircraft. The psychological impact on the enemy cannot be overstated. German and Japanese pilots knew that for every bomber they shot down, America could replace it in an hour. But manufacturing the weapons was only half the battle. America needed people to build them, and this created one of the most profound social transformations in American history. With millions of men shipping overseas to fight, factories desperately needed workers, and women answered the call. Rosie the Riveter became an icon, but she represented something much deeper. 6 million American women entered the workforce during World War II, many of them performing jobs previously reserved exclusively for men. At the Boeing plant in Seattle, women comprised 47% of the workforce by 1944. They welded, riveted, operated heavy machinery, and assembled complex aircraft components. And here's something remarkable. Studies showed that women workers were often more precise and detail-oriented than their male counterparts, producing fewer defects and maintaining higher quality standards. The American industrial miracle wasn't just about machines and assembly lines. It was about unleashing the full potential of an entire nation. Consider the story of the Liberty ships, perhaps the ultimate expression of American industrial audacity. These cargo vessels were designed to be cheap, simple, and fast to produce. Before the war, building a cargo ship took about a year. American shipyards, using prefabrication techniques and assembly line methods adapted from the auto industry, produced that time to an average of 42 days. Let that sink in. 6 weeks from laying the keel to launching a fully operational ocean-going vessel. But here's where American competitive spirit and showmanship come into play. In November 1942, the Richmond shipyard in California decided to break the record. They wanted to prove that American industrial might was limitless. Workers prefabricated entire sections of the SS Robert E. Peary in advance. Hull sections, superstructure, engine components, everything. When the clock started, it was like watching a massive three-dimensional puzzle snap together at impossible speed. Welders, riveters, pipe fitters, electricians swarmed the ship in perfectly choreographed chaos. 4 days and 15.5 hours later, the Robert E. Peary slid into the water, fully operational. It wasn't just a ship. It was a message to the Axis powers. You cannot sink our ships faster than we can build them. And they tried. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking Allied merchant vessels in a desperate attempt to strangle the lifeline of supplies flowing from America to Britain and the Soviet Union. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. But here's the beautiful mathematics of American industrial supremacy. American shipyards built 2,751 Liberty ships during the war. The Germans couldn't sink them fast enough. For every ship destroyed, 2 more took its place. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately won not by brilliant naval tactics or advanced sonar technology, but by sheer American industrial overwhelming force. German Admiral Karl Donitz later admitted that the Liberty ship program was one of the primary reasons Germany lost the war at sea. Now, let's talk about innovation under pressure, because American ingenuity wasn't just about quantity, it was about rapid adaptation and problem solving. When American forces invaded North Africa in 1942, they quickly discovered their tanks were inferior to German panzers. The 37mm guns on American Stuart tanks literally bounced off German armor. This wasn't acceptable. In a traditional military-industrial complex, redesigning and retooling for a new tank would take years. American engineers and factory managers solved the problem in months. The M4 Sherman was already in production, but it needed upgrades. Engineers developed the 76mm high-velocity gun. Factory workers implemented new armor configurations. Assembly lines were modified while still producing existing models. By mid-1944, improved Shermans with better guns and armor were rolling off production lines without any significant interruption in supply. Compare this to German tank development. The Germans spent years perfecting the Panther and Tiger tanks, creating engineering masterpieces that were complex, expensive, and impossible to produce in meaningful numbers. Meanwhile, American factories were pumping out 2,000 Shermans per month. The aircraft industry tells a similar story of American adaptability and scale. The P-51 Mustang, arguably the best fighter aircraft of World War II, went from initial concept to operational deployment in 178 days. Think about that! Less than 6 months from drawing board to combat. And it wasn't a rush job that compromised quality. The P-51 was a phenomenal aircraft that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do early in the war. American factories built over 15,000 P-51s. When German pilots saw Mustangs over Berlin in 1944, they knew the war was lost. The Luftwaffe couldn't replace aircraft or train pilots fast enough to match American production. For every German fighter shot down, America could send 5 replacements. The mathematics were brutal and inevitable. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of American industrial mobilization was the logistical coordination required to make it all work. Building the weapons was one challenge, getting them to the battlefields was another entirely. This is where American organizational genius truly shined. The Pentagon, completed in 1943, became the nerve center coordinating the most complex logistical operation in human history. Raw materials had to be sourced, processed, and distributed to thousands of factories. Components manufactured in different states had to arrive at assembly plants in precise sequence. Finished weapons had to be transported to ports, loaded onto ships, and delivered to combat theaters around the globe. And all of this had to happen continuously, 24 hours a day, coordinating millions of workers, thousands of factories, hundreds of shipping routes. Consider just one example: aluminum. Aircraft production required massive quantities of aluminum, but in 1939, America's aluminum production was woefully inadequate. The government worked with industry to build new aluminum refineries, enormous facilities requiring vast amounts of electricity. They chose locations near hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest. Within 2 years, American aluminum production increased by 600%. Similar expansions occurred in steel, rubber, and petroleum refining. The United States didn't just convert existing industry to war production, it built entirely new industries from scratch at unprecedented speed. And here's the remarkable part: this was done by a democratic nation without forced labor, without slave labor camps, without the brutal methods employed by Germany and Japan. American workers volunteered for overtime shifts, worked through holidays, and set production records because they believed in the cause. Factory floors became patriotic battlegrounds where every rivet, every weld, every assembly contributed to defeating tyranny. The Axis powers never understood this. Hitler famously dismissed American industrial capacity, believing that a nation corrupted by democracy, capitalism, and diverse immigration could never match Germanic discipline and efficiency. Japanese military leaders similarly underestimated American resolve, believing that soft, comfort-loving Americans would never endure the sacrifices necessary for total war. They were catastrophically wrong. Because American industry didn't operate on totalitarian compulsion. It ran on competitive innovation, entrepreneurial spirit, and genuine patriotic commitment. Factory managers competed to break production records. Workers took pride in their contribution to the war effort. Companies innovated not because the government mandated it, but because American business culture rewarded problem-solving and efficiency. By 1944, the results spoke for themselves. The United States was producing 40% of all munitions used by Allied forces worldwide. American factories supplied not just U.S. forces, but equipped British, Soviet, Chinese, and Free French armies. Through the Lend-Lease program, America sent 400,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, more than the USSR's entire pre-war production. These trucks allowed Soviet forces to maintain mobility during their counteroffensive against Germany. American-built aircraft flew in Royal Air Force squadrons. British soldiers carried American rifles. The entire Allied war effort flowed on a tide of American-made equipment. Let's talk numbers, because the statistics are almost incomprehensible. From 1941 to 1945, American factories produced 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 17.4 million rifles and carbines, 2.4 million trucks, 2.6 million machine guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and 4.9 million tons of artillery shells. In 1944 alone, the peak production year, American factories built one ship every single day and one aircraft every 5 minutes. Every single day. The Axis powers, even combining Germany, Japan, and Italy's total industrial output, couldn't match even 60% of American production. The psychological impact on enemy forces was devastating. German soldiers captured in 1944 and 1945 frequently expressed shock and despair at the quantity of American equipment. They described being overwhelmed not by superior tactics or individual soldier skill, but by sheer material abundance. One German officer captured after the Battle of the Bulge stated, "We fought with excellence and courage, but they simply had endless supplies. For every tank we destroyed, 3 more appeared. Our Panther was better than the Sherman, but they had 20 Shermans for every Panther we fielded. How do you fight mathematics?" Japanese soldiers in the Pacific had similar experiences. American amphibious assaults featured such overwhelming firepower, from naval bombardment to aerial saturation bombing to endless supplies of artillery shells, that Japanese defensive positions, no matter how well prepared, were simply obliterated by material superiority. This industrial supremacy enabled American military strategy in profound ways. General Dwight Eisenhower could plan the D-Day invasion, knowing that if any equipment was lost, it could be rapidly replaced. Admiral Chester Nimitz could conduct island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific, secure in the knowledge that destroyed ships, aircraft, and supplies would be replenished faster than the Japanese could inflict losses. American commanders could afford to use overwhelming force because American factories ensured overwhelming force was available. This stands in stark contrast to German and Japanese strategic planning, which constantly had to account for irreplaceable losses. Every Tiger tank destroyed was a permanent loss. Every experienced pilot killed couldn't be replaced. The Axis fought with excellence, but finite resources. America fought with inexhaustible abundance. The human stories behind these statistics are equally compelling. Take the story of workers at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit. When the facility opened in 1940, nobody there had ever built a tank. They made cars. But American workers adapted with remarkable speed. Machinists learned to work with armor plate. Welders developed techniques for the specialized steel used in military vehicles. Assembly line workers mastered the installation of complex weapon systems. Within a year, the Chrysler Arsenal was the most productive tank factory in the world. Workers took pride in their contribution. Many posted photographs of their sons, husbands, or brothers in uniform beside their workstations, a constant reminder that the tank they were building might save a loved one's life. This personal connection to the war effort created quality control that no government mandate could enforce. Workers caught defects and corrected problems because they knew American soldiers' lives depended on their craftsmanship. Or consider the story of Andrew Higgins, a New Orleans boat builder who designed the LCVP, the Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, more commonly known as the Higgins boat. This simple, flat-bottomed landing craft could carry 36 men from ship to shore, deploy them directly onto beaches, and retract. It seems simple, but it revolutionized amphibious warfare. Eisenhower later called Higgins the man who won the war for us, because without the Higgins boat, the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific and the D-Day invasion would have been impossible. Higgins Industries built over 20,000 landing craft during the war. But here's the remarkable part. Higgins was a civilian entrepreneur with no military experience who saw a problem and solved it through American ingenuity and business acumen. His workforce included a higher percentage of racial minorities and women than almost any other wartime manufacturer. Higgins didn't care about pre-war social prejudices, he cared about winning and making the best product. This is the American spirit in action. As the war progressed, the cumulative effect of American industrial production became undeniable. By 1945, the Axis powers were collapsing under material deprivation. Germany was desperately trying to produce jet aircraft and wonder weapons, with factories being bombed daily and fuel supplies evaporating. Japan was reduced to building suicide weapons, kamikazes, human torpedoes, suicide boats, because they lacked the resources to produce conventional weapons in meaningful numbers. Meanwhile, American factories were operating at such capacity that planners were already discussing conversion back to peacetime production. The war was won, not by a single heroic bluff or brilliant tactical maneuver, but by millions of Americans who showed up to factory shifts, pulled overtime, innovated solutions, and built victory one rivet at a time. The legacy of America's industrial mobilization extends far beyond World War II. The techniques, technologies, and organizational methods developed during the war transformed American industry permanently. The mass production expertise translated into post-war economic dominance. The engineering innovations pioneered in wartime factories led to the jet age, the space program, and the computer revolution. The social changes, particularly regarding women in the workforce and racial integration in industry, laid groundwork for the civil rights movements of subsequent decades. But perhaps most importantly, the arsenal of democracy proved that free societies, democratic governments, and capitalist economies could mobilize more effectively than totalitarian regimes. Hitler and Tojo believed that only authoritarian control could harness national resources for total war. They were proven catastrophically wrong. American workers operating in freedom, motivated by patriotism and fair wages, outproduced slave labor by orders of magnitude. This is the untold story that deserves remembering. When we think of World War II heroes, we picture soldiers storming beaches, pilots dogfighting over Europe, or Marines raising flags on Pacific islands. Those men and women deserve every accolade. But behind every soldier was a factory worker who built his rifle. Behind every pilot was a team of engineers who designed her aircraft. Behind every Marine was a shipyard worker who constructed the vessel that delivered him to battle. The arsenal of democracy was built by ordinary Americans, performing extraordinary feats of production, innovation, and dedication. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. They endured rationing, blackouts, and the constant anxiety of loved ones in danger. And they did it willingly, knowing that every tank, every shell, every aircraft brought victory closer. In the final accounting, World War II was won on many fronts. On the beaches of Normandy, in the skies over Germany, across the islands of the Pacific. But it was won decisively in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, and the assembly plants across the American heartland. This was America's superpower, not just the courage of its soldiers, but the productivity of its workers. Not just the brilliance of its generals, but the ingenuity of its engineers. Not just the sacrifice of men in uniform, but the dedication of millions on the home front who turned America into the arsenal of democracy that saved the world from tyranny. So the next time you see a World War II documentary or read a history book focusing on famous battles and celebrated generals, remember this: behind every victory was American industrial might. Behind every successful campaign was logistical superiority built in American factories. The greatest bluff of World War II wasn't a tactical deception. It was America's transformation from the 17th-ranked military power to the industrial colossus that outproduced all enemies combined in the span of 4 years. And if you found this story compelling, if you want to hear more untold tales of American ingenuity and heroism from World War II, subscribe to our channel, because the greatest generation didn't just fight, they built, they innovated, and they produced victory itself.